Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
WisconsinEye is on the campus of Gateway Technical College in Sturtevant. Will Demet of Whitefish Bay is a Democratic candidate in the 23rd Assembly District. Will, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
What do you consider your top issue in your race for the Assembly?
I consider my top issue to be the environment. Specifically, in the spring, the Journal-Sentinel, I saw an article. They published a report from the American Lung Association that said they gave Milwaukee and Ozaukee counties an F rating for smog. And air quality is a huge quality of life and health issue. And I think there's a lot more we can do as a state to fix this problem. Our state burns much more coal than any neighboring states do. And coal is about the worst kind of fuel you can burn for air quality, and it also happens to be a much greater contributor to carbon emissions and makes global warming much worse, global climate change. So I want to enact policies that will increase the amount of renewable energy we use in the state. My district is along what I hope to be my district is along Lake Michigan. And there are high winds and a lot of potential for wind energy along the lake, and I think we could use that as a way to reduce our dependence on coal, improve the climate, and improve public health at the same time. Governor Walker has actually increased regulations on windmills in the state, despite claiming to be against government regulations, so I think that's the first area we need to look at is repealing regulations on new wind farms and encouraging increased consumption of alternative energy and less coal energy in the state.
It's been years since we have set a renewable energy standard for the state. Mm-hmm. We had 10%, I think we've achieved it. Mm-hmm. And what do you think the renewable energy standard for the state should be?
Well, I think it's something we have to approach gradually, so I don't have a number. I mean, I think ultimately we do have to get off carbon fuels completely for the climate. And I think the best way to start is by reducing our consumption of coal, which is the worst offender. Even moving from coal to natural gas pays dividends in terms of less emissions and better air quality, better health. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't point to a number, but I think we have to constantly be increasing it, and I think this is the best place to start.
Okay, let's run down some issues that you'd be voting on, playing a role on if you're elected. The impasse in the Capitol over how to pay for highways and bridges, our highway future. How would you fix it?
Well, I deal with this a lot. I'm a village trustee in Whitefish Bay. I've served since 2014, and we have a state highway that goes through Whitefish Bay, State Highway 32, which is Lake Drive, and it's in a state of disrepair. And we in the village are responsible for half of the money that goes toward repairing it, and the state is responsible for the other half. And we've had a very difficult time getting the state to live up to its commitment. And it seems like Lake Drive is a very low priority for the state. And if it's the case that we don't have enough money for highways generally, I think infrastructure is one of the most critical things we spend money on in the state. Our economy depends on it. Just doing economic transactions is dependent upon buyers and sellers being able to connect. So I'm in favor of increasing highway spending. One way to potentially do that, if we truly don't have the money in the budget now to pay for it, would be to enact tolls so that we can get out-of-state drivers to contribute to the upkeep and maintenance of the roads. We have lots of drivers coming in from Illinois who have summer homes on lakes in Wisconsin, and they pay a little bit through the gas tax, but I think if we need more state highway money, we should look into possibly having tolls.
not consider really raising the gas tax then, pursue tolling, excuse me, as a long
No, I'd
range?
also be in favor of increasing the gas tax.
How many pennies do you think?
However many we need to adequately address our road spending. I mean, I don't, environmental issues are one of my top concerns also, so I do think we need to support alternate modes of transportation. Rail would be one of them in the long term, and increase public transportation often. So, we should try to decrease our dependence on driving, and raising the gas tax is a way to disincentivize driving. But I wouldn't be looking to be punitive with that. I think we should have the gas tax raised to the appropriate amount to cover the spending we have for roads. And clearly we're not spending enough, or it's not being prioritized right, as evidenced by Lake Drive in the 23rd Assembly District.
As a village trustee, local governments have been living with levy limits since 2006.
Mm-hmm.
Is it time to loosen levy limits, get rid of them, or keep them in place?
I'm opposed to levy limits in principle, so I've served on the Whitefish Bay Village Board since 2014. So that's affected me during my entire tenure, so I honestly don't know any different, but just in principle, I think local governments should have control. They were elected by their own constituents at the local level to deal with local issues, and I don't think the state of Wisconsin should be going in and micromanaging local communities and telling them what to do, telling them what their spending and taxation policies should be. We've been fortunate in Whitefish Bay in that in recent years we haven't had to increase rates for the most part because we've seen home values increase. And which is very fortunate because Whitefish Bay suffered a lot of flooding in 2010, I believe it was, and we needed to do a lot of infrastructure spending to rebuild our sewer system. So it's very fortunate that the value of housing was increasing at the same time, because that gave us a lot of wiggle room to do these much needed infrastructure improvements. But the things local governments do are not really optional. It's things like collecting your trash. It's making sure you have water and that when you flush the toilet it goes away and doesn't come back up in your basement. Police, schools. So these aren't really optional pieces of spending, and we could run into a situation, many local governments could, where you have a crisis like we had in Whitefish Bay with flooding, and Shorewood had the same thing, where you actually need to make major investments, and we were lucky at the time that we had a lot of flexibility, but that might not always be the case. So I don't think state government should second guess local authorities, and I think the levy limit should be eliminated, and we should give local communities full autonomy over their own taxing and spending.
In the wake of school shooting and mass shootings, do we need to change gun laws?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, I would be in favor of reintroducing and expanding waiting periods, background checks. I'm actually in favor of most regulations on guns. I think we're limited in what we can do, partially because of the Supreme Court. But I think in the long term, if I were, king for a day, my policy would be to ban handguns and to only have single-shot hunting rifles. I would ban assault weapons and handguns. But we're limited in our capacity to do that because of conservative Supreme Court decisions. But in the meantime, I would, favor any sort of background checks, waiting periods, just common sense gun regulations that I think most people should be able to get behind.
Florida's governor raised the age to buy a gun to 21. Should Wisconsin consider that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The current state budget had a pretty large increase in money for K-12 public schools.
Mm-hmm.
Was that enough, or do you think another large bump will be needed in the next 2-year state budget?
I think we should have another large bump. I think this is an investment in the quality of our economy and society for decades to come. I think teachers are underpaid. I happen to know a lot of teachers, including my fiance taught in Milwaukee for a couple of years, and a lot of teachers are actually having to spend money out of their own pockets for school supplies, and that's, I think, completely scandalous that we put them in that kind of a moral quandary where they're spending their own personal money when it really should be the district stepping up to provide for the students. So teachers aren't paid enough, the schools aren't well funded enough. I do think we need to see another increase, and I would look to, during my tenure in the state assembly, see that schools have much more funding than they have for the past several years.
Do you have an idea, if we should spend more money in K-12 public schools, how would you come up with the money?
Well, I do think we should look into increasing the sales tax. That's a pretty efficient way to collect money. You know, income taxes, well, number one, at the federal level, it's becoming less advantageous for states to raise income taxes because there's the deduction is being removed for that. And there's a lot less tax avoidance that's possible when you have a sales tax. So I would say, and you could have exceptions for food and rent and things like that, but increase the sales tax because, you know, again, education, I think it should be a priority for state spending, and it's inadequate how it is, and we have to be able to pay our bills. And, you know, nobody likes paying taxes, but everyone wants high quality services too. Everyone wants high quality education, and you need to pay for that. So I think sales tax is something, a sales tax increase, if necessary, is something we should look into.
The choice to voucher program has started out in Milwaukee, now Racine, now statewide. What's your position on it?
I'm against further expansion of the choice program into the rest of the state. When I've looked at research on the performance of vouchers in statewide expansions in recent years that have gone on in states like Louisiana, the results haven't been encouraging. In fact, they've been worse as a result of school vouchers. Yes, they've actually diminished results. And in Milwaukee, the program isn't going away anytime soon, nor should it. I mean, it's like a quarter of the population of Milwaukee, the city, currently receives a voucher. So you can't eliminate the program. You can't send people back into the public schools. The system can't accommodate it as it is. But I'm in favor of more regulations on the program and stopping the expansion into the rest of the state. One of the regulations that I think should apply across the board to voucher schools would be to only allow students to enter in kindergarten or first grade when they're first starting school. Studies have shown that mobility is very bad for student achievement. Switching schools during the year or even into their education can be very disruptive. It definitely is in Milwaukee, and that's one of the reasons for Milwaukee's low achievement, is because there's such a high student mobility rate. Not only kids moving schools, but kids moving homes. And I don't think we should be experimenting with our children's education. I think children need to be allowed to continue their education all the way through in one school. So I think that's one regulation that I think needs to be put in place. The program's not going away, but I think we should not further expand it into the rest of the state, because the results nationwide are not encouraging for those kinds of programs.
A big issue in the next state budget will be whether we need a new state prison. With the prison in Green Bay and Waupun built in the 1800s, we're closing the 2 juvenile prisons. Do we need a new state prison?
Well, we shouldn't. So I think the larger issue is that our prison population is too large. We shouldn't have nonviolent drug offenders in prison to begin with. So I think that the appropriate response, even to the most dangerous of drugs, is they should remain illegal in the case of like heroin, but the punishment, so-called, shouldn't really be a punishment. I think these people are victims, and it's not appropriate to throw them in prison. I think drug users should be given mandatory rehabilitation. They should be put in clinics. The prison system is not the place for them. I think that makes the problem worse and increases criminality and increases, we have very high recidivism rates And I think that's another thing to look at. Our prison system is kind of perpetuating itself and leading to further expenses down the line because we don't have a rehabilitative focus. So I think we should reduce the number of people in prison in the first place by not putting people in prison who are just drug users and really need help and therapy, not to be punished. And then I think that the number one goal of our system should be rehabilitation. And if we do that, we're going to see long-term cost savings. We have one of the highest prison populations in the world in America, and we see in European countries that focus on rehabilitation, they have much lower recidivism rates. So I think that's what we need to move toward. In the short term, if it is necessary in order to prevent overcrowding in prisons, to build another, I suppose I would support that. But I think the larger issue is how we treat criminal justice in this state and in this country, and I think we're going about it completely wrong.
Well, part of that debate is it time to legalize recreational marijuana and medical marijuana?
Yeah, so I think the first step is definitely to legalize medical marijuana. I don't see any convincing argument against it. If a doctor is prescribing a patient with marijuana, I don't think members of the public or the legislature are really in a position to second guess a doctor. So that I think is an obvious first step. And then perhaps down the road, recreational marijuana should also be legalized. It's not good for teenagers, causes long-term problems, so it should definitely be similar to alcohol, where you have to be 21 in order to buy it. And we should do everything we can to make sure children don't have access to it. But I think it should be treated more like alcohol in the long term. And I think the first step to doing that is to have medical marijuana in the state.
Two questions on healthcare. The first is healthcare in rural areas. They have older residents. Young people are leaving. More and more healthcare provided by Medicare or Medicaid. Your thoughts on how to continue, maybe even improve healthcare in rural areas?
Well, I think that part of what's driving a lot of the discrepancies in it's really a screwed up system, to be honest, our healthcare system. When you look internationally, other countries achieve much better results at much lower costs. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this is done at the federal level. I'd personally be in favor of Medicare for all, universal healthcare system. As far as what we can do in the state, I think it was foolish of the governor to turn away the Medicare expansion. That would have helped our state very much. And I also would like to go to a system where we don't have tuition at public colleges and universities. I think part of what drives healthcare costs is the need of doctors to repay their undergraduate medical school debt. And I think if we were to reduce or eliminate tuition, which is what I think we need to do in the long term, I think doctors would not have to charge such high prices for their services in order to pay down their debt. And I think a lot of doctors would have more flexibility to go open clinics in rural areas, especially if they're from there originally, without being saddled with enormous amounts of debt.
So then do you believe then the state government has a role in retaining and recruiting doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals?
Yeah, we should to the extent that we can. Another thing that's made medical costs more expensive is there's not enough doctors. So like I said before, eliminating tuition would be a way to encourage talented people to go into medicine. Perhaps opening up more medical schools in the state to train more doctors is something the state should look into. Whatever we can do, I think we should do. It's largely out of our control in terms of where people choose to practice medicine, but I think we can definitely make it a more friendly environment by doing some common sense reforms.
Now, do you have a primary on August 14th?
I do, yes.
Do you want to talk about differences? You want to highlight any differences between you and your primary opponent?
I have good experience having served on the village board since 2014. I I believe that's the most experience of the three candidates in my race. But I really want to differentiate myself on the issues. I've already gone over, what my priorities are and the issues I want to emphasize. I want to improve the environment. I want to improve education, increase our investment in education. I want to improve the state's infrastructure. So if voters on the 23rd agree with me on those priorities, I'd hope they'd vote for me.
Thank you. Will Demet of Whitefish Bay is a Democrat running in the 23rd Assembly District. The primary is August 14th. Will, thank you for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.